Well, hello, everyone. This is Jason Lesandrini. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Ethics, Advanced Care Planning, Spiritual Health at Wellstar Health System. And I'm here today to sort of give you the overview for the Board of Governors exam for the section on professionalism and ethics. I will tell you, as a fellow myself, and working in ethics, this section should be pretty easy and pretty straightforward for the group, but there are always questions and challenges that come up. So you'll see at the end, I have my email address. You're always welcome to reach out to me directly, and I look forward to our conversation regarding particular questions or things you might have in the live session coming up. All right, so let's get started. So the professionalism and ethics section has historically been about 8% of the knowledge areas with roughly 16 to 7 questions. It's the same as business and legal issues. It's more than governance and IT. And then you can see it's slightly less than quality, finance, and human resources. There are some key focus areas that we know are on this portion of the exam. So what they're looking for is developing, monitoring, and maintenance of procedures to ensure the needs of professional staff are met. It includes monitoring and disseminating and identifying codes of professional conduct, understanding the implications of ethical decisions, providing procedures to monitor standards of behavior, and then determining, maintaining, and monitoring accountability procedures. As some of you may know, as a brief history lesson, the American College of Hospital Administrators was established in 1933 with the following hallmarks. One that's particularly relevant is bullet point 3 is a code of ethics. And what you'll find in the American College of Healthcare Executives Code of Ethics is this hearkening back, and these code of ethics have stood true over time. I would tell you as a good tip or trick for preparation for this exam that reviewing the code of ethics is probably a smart idea. I remember when I was choosing which stuff I was going to focus in on, I definitely reviewed the code of ethics a couple times to make sure I knew what was included in it. So what are some core definitions? So ethics is defined according to American College of Healthcare Executives as the philosophical study of the moral value of human conduct and the rules and principles that ought to govern it. Keep in mind, this definition is the definition that ACHE uses. There are many other definitions of what ethics is, but given that they're testing you on the knowledge from ACHE and the Fundamentals of Healthcare Management book, it is crucial that you use this definition and not what our perception about what the definition is. Sociological ethics is defined as self-regulatory guidelines for making decisions and defining processes. Medical ethics is a system of moral principles that applies to values in the practice of clinical medicine and scientific research. And then organizational ethics is the principles and standards by which businesses operate, who an organization says they are, the values they live by, and decisions. All of these types of ethics are covered in the Board of Governors exam. So let's be very clear. Healthcare executives have a special charge for ethics and a responsibility to a number of stakeholders: patients, clients, others served, their own organization, its staff and personnel, themselves, the profession, and even society. And so these can create unique challenges that come up as a result. The test is not going to ask what the right answer or wrong answer might be in a particular case, but it's going to ask you to apply these principles that are coming up and the knowledge of the profession to sort of, the profession and the professional statements to particular situations. And so you'll see as a result that the college has actually put out policy statements that are often covered in the exam itself. So you can go to the website, to the American College of Healthcare Executives website, and you can see each of these policies listed here. These are the core ethical policy statements. There may be a few here and there that touch outside, but this is where the majority of it is. So considerations for executives on supplier interactions, how to create an ethical environment, decisions near the end of life, ethical decision makings for healthcare executives, reduction in force, issues to staff shortages, health information and confidentiality, impaired healthcare executives, promise keeping, making, and rescinding. Now, I remember when preparing for my Board of Governors exam, Raul told me that he went out and read all of these statements and sort of was very, very familiar with them before he took the exam. I too went out and took a look at the exam, but I did not, I spent a little time on them, but did not spend an immense amount of time, partly I think because of sort of my background, but they can be very long statements and have a lot of intricate details. My second tip for you for this is I would at least review them, but I don't think you need to memorize them. That's Jason's sense on the thing, but I do think you should at least take a look. There are also public policy statements that could be on the Board of Governor exam. These are the core ones out there: access to healthcare, responsibilities to their communities, role in emergency preparedness, which is even more important today, organ, tissue, blood, marrow donation, and then employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. Again, I would take a look at these. That I think is a strong tactic. It's up to the individual learner about how much they want to sit and work through them, but I would definitely take some time to review them. And then last but not least, there are a number of professional policy statements that that ACHE has put out. And you can see these here, from board certification, responsibility for mentoring. These are about professionalism, which is included in the ethics and professionalism section. What does it mean to be a professional, to be a healthcare executive, right? Commitments to lifelong learning, commitments to racial and ethnic diversity in healthcare, evaluating the performance of health system CEOs, right? How do we consider older experienced healthcare executives, terms of employment for executives? So that's the sort of, there's a interweaving of the professionalism and ethics stuff that happens in these policy statements. Again, as you can see, there are a number of policy statements that ACHE has put out that have a potential for to be on the exam. That being said, I will be a broken record. I would review them, but I would review each of them and make a determination on how much time you think you need to review them and study them in order to prepare for the exam. All right. You can see there are additional ACHE website ethics policy statements. We've mentioned a few of them here already. You can go to ache.org and actually see those that will be published in the annual report. So let's get to the meat of the conversation. So ACHE has a code of ethics, as should any profession in the country, in the world, and across the globe. And you should know that the main intent of a code of ethics is to serve as a standard of conduct for its members. So the ACHE code of ethics is used to judge whether executives, healthcare executives, are living up to the conduct that's required of them as a profession. It was established in 1939. There have been multiple iterations, which is what a code of ethics should do. And there was a major revision in '87 and finally an additional amendment in 2017. No, the code is reviewed and updated annually. You'll see an announcement for this on the website that the code is going to be undergoing revision, but know that it's always reviewed and updated as appropriate. Now, given we're doing this via webinar, not a live video, you can go to the code yourself and click on this link. It won't translate into the webinar, but you can see exactly what the code is and the statements that sort of ACHE finds is essential to the profession of a healthcare executive and to the standard conduct for that executive and its members. So you'll see when you click that link that the code encompasses the of moral advocacy, which requires accountable of their work. So meaning healthcare executives are not supposed to commit malfeasance, which is wrongdoing or unlawful acts, right? You'll see this in the code. 2, nonfeasance, right? So failing what ought to be done. You can be held accountable for not doing what ought to be done, what ought to be expected of a healthcare executive. That's what the code of ethics is actually getting after. And then misfeasance, right? Performing a lawful action in an illegal or improper way. And you'll see the code highlights those as well. So key to take away from the code is that the code is basically setting up a standard of conduct that healthcare executives can be held accountable for. So should a particular executive do a wrongful or unlawful act, the code of ethics can be cited to say you didn't adhere to what we expected from you as a healthcare executive, or if you didn't do what you were supposed to, and so on and so forth. As part of this, it's worth noting that the American College of Healthcare Executives requires its members to bring to the attention ethics committees, to its ethics committee, information that believes where there has been an infraction of the code. So if a particular executive is doing wrongdoing and they're a member of ACHE, fellow, whatever it may be, ACHE believes one should bring that information to the ethics committee that then formally and officially approves, or not approves, excuse me, reviews the violation of the sort of code of ethics. This can result in a number of things. It can result in nothing. It can result in removal of them as a member, sanctioning, whatever it may be from the ethics committee. All right. Now to the meat and section of clinical ethics. Most of the clinical ethics stuff is based on a few documents. One is the American Medical Association's Principles of Medical Ethics. It's also based on some other work that was done out of Georgetown in the late 80s, 1990s around principlism, and we're going to get to that stuff. Please note, this is not a philosophy class on ethics. This is not a philosophy class on bioethics. This is about how does one prepare for the Board of Governors exam and the types of questions that they're going to ask around clinical ethics. So please do not get nervous or worry that you're going to have to become a moral expert or a moral philosopher. It's not testing that, right? It's not testing, do you know the categorical imperative? It's not about that, right? So the AMA Principles of Medical Ethics were adopted in 1803. They're the result of a very famous English physician, Thomas Percival. There have been continuous revisions, just like with the ACHA's Code of Ethics, continuous revisions to the Principles of Ethics that incorporate tradition of Hippocratic Oath and are really thinking about, initially had thought about the governing relationship between the patient and the physician, and now the AMA has expanded to the governing relationship between physician and community, physician and industry, and you'll see the expansion, just like with the American College of Healthcare Executives, as we've reiterated and updated our Code of Ethics. We continue to see that there are new relationships that require new statements or new sort of parameters around the type of conduct we expect or believe a healthcare executive should have. So the principles in this, in the AMA's Principles of Ethics, address standards of conduct that define the behavior of an honorable physician. So being competent, compassionate, respectful, providing safe care to all, being honest, including reporting deficient physicians. It talks about issues around confidentiality and privacy, that you have an obligation to continual learning, as do most codes of ethics in the world, that you have to continue to be continue to be in that profession. Ongoing learning is required. You have a responsibility to your patient that is paramount, and you have a responsibility to the community and betterment of public. Not surprising, the American Nurses Association has a code of ethics for nurses. And again, it reiterates a lot of the same things. So you'll see themes that exist throughout all these codes. So the ANA's Code of Ethics created in 1893 with the Florence Nightingale Pledge, and then the 1896 Article of Incorporation. Basically, the idea here is that the goal of nursing is to support the client's responsibility, the patient, right, and self-determination to the greatest extent possible. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the intricacies of the Code of Ethics for nursing, partly because there are going to be slim to any particular questions on, tell me what provision 7 in the American Nurses Association's Code of Ethics says, because they were not testing you on whether you know the American Nurses Code of Ethics. It's more about professionalism and codes of ethics, that there are standards of conduct that are put out by professional organizations to sort of initially, I think, regulate behavior, but I think more importantly, to drive people towards better behavior, right? To influence them to actually be better professionals. So the ANA sets out the relationship from the nurse to the patient, to another nurse, to the self, to others, to profession, to society, and nursing in general to society. And it does these through 9 key provisions. And you can see those provisions here on the screen. There are tons, as I said before, every profession has a code of ethics for its own group, and it's about providing self-regulation, right? It must be sufficiently precise in order to guide people in a meaningful way, right? But it also can't be a document that just we put up on the wall and say, so be it, right? Those are our guiding principles. It actually has to provide us with meaningful guidance to do the right thing, especially in those times where people are uncertain. Just like any code of ethics, the ACHE Code of Ethics has a commitment, as does the profession, to ongoing continuing education. And it is no surprise that continuing education about the ethical code is part of that expectation by any profession, even including the American College of Healthcare Executives. So we're now going to get into a little more detail about ethics. This is very cursory. It's not super complicated. I hope not a super complicated version, but there are particularly 2 theories that often come up when you're thinking through ethics issues, especially in relationship to the Board of Governors exam, that come up around issues around patients' rights and responsibilities. And those 2 are utilitarianism and deontology. And so I'm just going to give you a cursory overview. So a utilitarian would say things like, whether something is right or wrong depends on the outcome of decision, of the action. So there's a general principle that says the greatest good is what is morally correct. So if you have a choice between building a clinic over here and building a clinic over here as an executive, utilitarianism would tell us that we should pick the clinic that will lead it to the greatest good. And you'll see the limits here often are around, well, what value, what is the good, who counts, right? And different theories of utilitarianism say different things count. So most will say each person counts for one, but then who do we include, right? And then 2 issues of justice, because you could say, for example, a good example that's often used is the example of organ donation. It would be better to kill Jason to save 10 other people with his organs. That could be justified based on utilitarian grounds, okay? People will often say the ends justify the means with utilitarianism. I hear that regularly. And that's true in some weak sense, that they're really concerned about outcomes, not how we get there, right? So kill Jason, save 10 people, build this clinic, even if it's going to demolish a cemetery, right, of an indigenous population, right? Because if we need that land so we can help the 5,000 community members, right? So there are versions of that sort of skirt around that, but for the Board of Governors exam, that's roughly what you need to know. Contrary to that is a theory called deontology that's based on duty, right? The idea that rights or wrongs are produced by what the action is itself, right? So take for example, the means matter for a deontologist. It's about what is my duty to a person. So famous version of it is Immanuel Kant, and he said what he called 2 universal maxims. So you only will those maxims that you can will to be universal. So would this apply in every situation? If I were a healthcare executive and I were choosing between building a clinic here or building a clinic here, could I will that in every situation where an executive was deciding that they would choose this option, right? Choose the option A versus option B. And what matters is how we get there. It's about what deontology will often say is treating other people, right? As rational beings to be able to determine for themselves what they want done. Really what's been driving medical ethics for the last 30 plus years is these principles, and these I've seen on the exam. So I would make sure you understand these. So the first one being, first principle is respect for persons, and we tend to hear that regularly around autonomy, right? That patients should have the autonomy to determine what they want done with their body, right? So when I'm trying to make a decision about should we force this treatment on a patient, and the patient's saying, I don't want it, autonomy is the principle at play, because a capacitated patient should have the right to be able to make their own decision. That's often weighted against a couple of these other principles, but not always. You can see beneficence and non-maleficence competing, justice and beneficence, and they can all compete against each other. That's the context in which healthcare operates, is that when you're creating a personal ethic, or when you're dealing with ethics issues in healthcare, it's about competing values, right? So you could have respect for persons that's competing against beneficence, which is doing good, right? So we in healthcare have an obligation to do what's in our patient's best interest, or do what's good for them, or do what's good for the community, not for self-interest, right? And doing good can also compete with doing what's best for a patient, may compete from what the patient is telling you they want. That can also compete with this obligation to our principle about non-maleficence, which is we shouldn't do harm, right? And we know that a lot of the things that we do in healthcare do cause harm, whether it be directly with patients, healthcare decisions, right? So think about any decisions that have been happening recently: buildings, mergers, acquisitions, mandates, PPE, you name it. We have competing principles at play, and we're, as healthcare leaders, trying to navigate how they come into conflict, or what I would even suggest is how they apply, some uncertainty about what does this principle or tell me. The last one, which has been extremely relevant these days, is justice, which is about due process, giving people fair processes to do things, but also, and when we call that as procedural justice, right? So setting up fair procedures. So as a healthcare executive, you need to set up fair appeals process for patients to challenge their bills. That's satisfying the principle of justice, right? You have to balance that by doing what's best for the institution, right? So setting up a fair process and balancing that with an institution. So ideally, you could have 8,000 people who are working on claims, right? And that would push claims through very quickly and allow people to appeal and do it. But then you would have no one else to be able to take care of the patients. And so you have to balance those competing values. So doing best with what's the community. The other portion of justice is that we need to think about this thing called distributive justice, which is about how do we distribute benefits and burdens, right? So we often think about this in research, but it comes out in clinical ethics. Say you're going to create an ECMO program, right? And you're going to build the ECMO program in a community-based or an inner city hospital, right? So the inner city group is going to yield the benefits for that program, but you're not able to build a program out in your community hospital or your rural hospital, right? And so there's going to be burdens incurred by those families who, in order to access it, have to drive up to the city, right? Or whatever it may be, or fly from out of state to be able to access it. And so these principles are often in competition with each other. And as a healthcare leader, our job is to participate in an ethical decision-making process to balance those values out to come to an ethically resolved decision. These principles often derive from the Belmont Report, which was created in 1979 as a result of a lot of the research stuff that was, guiding the way we responded to the Nuremberg trial and the Nazi experimentation on Jews. And so out of that Nuremberg trial came principles governing mostly in European countries, how we would think about research on human beings. And then in 1978, the United States adopted its own version called the Belmont Report. There was a report written on the Belmont Report, and then regulations were created as a result of that. But these four principles apply outside of even the research context. They're actually appropriate for medical context, sociological context, and organizational context, just like we talked about on the first couple slides. So keeping in mind, principles guiding people should permeate an organization's philosophy. It should not be that you have a statement on the wall and that's it, right? And no one lives out those values. That's not guiding an organization's ethics, a person's ethics. That's just a statement on the wall. It should be reflected in the mission statement and other written expressions of values. And ACHE believes this, and I think every organization believes this. It should be reflected in the policies, procedures, and rules used by the organization. And these principles should be part of the personal ethic of the executive as part of all decision making. So if I'm gonna, again, I keep coming back to this example, open a clinic or create a new program or do whatever, I should base that on values of the organization and values I hold as a profession. There are a couple questions that I've seen on the Board of Governor exam around ethics committees. I will tell you this is based on the fundamentals of healthcare management understanding and the way ACHE understands it currently. There's a lot of trend recently to change this in the ethics space, but you're not being tested on the trend. So the ethics committees have a standard triad of functions. They provide education, they provide policy advice, and they do consultation, right? More often than not, you all will work in an organization, or those of you who work in acute care spaces will have access to an ethics committee, or you can have access to an ethics consultant who will do these things or orchestrate a program that does these things. Usually for physicians, patients, staff, you'll see things focused on medical ethics, right? The ethics of the interaction of patients and providers in the daily practice of healthcare. But we also know that ethics committees can be useful for ethical issues around administration, around leadership. So I've worked with multiple organizations over the years that have accessed ethics resources, be it an ethics committee or ethics consultant like myself, to help them address administrative ethics. And I will put this plug out there. I think you all should be doing that to live up, to ensure you're living up to the standards that ACHE are suggesting. They do suggest that leaders should access their ethics committee or ethics program or ethics consultants to help them resolve conflicts or uncertainties about values. The history of ethics committees is complex, but clearly there's some key points. The first point was as a result of the Federal Child and Abuse Amendments in 1984, where they created infant care review committees. Basically, there were a number of court cases around treatment for children, babies who had disabilities. A couple of them, encephalopathy, I think there was a few others. And so there was a requirement from this federal regulation that hospital personnel are educated on responsibilities to disabled patients, that there should be institutional guidelines set up to withholding treatment. And I think most organizations have this beyond even infants, they have it in adults. And that there should be some counsel and review in a case. And when oftentimes that's how the ethics committees got started, was out of these regulations. So you'll see on this slide, there's ethics consultation that's offered. That actually came from more than likely the ICRC. In addition, there was another trend that was going on, which was the Institutional Review Board, as I mentioned before, which came out of IRBs came out of lots of causes, but mainly coming from Declaration of Helsinki, the Nuremberg trial, the need to sort of regulate human subjects research in the United States. And so the Department of Health and Human Services establishes in the Code of Federal Regulations institutional review boards, and it was required if you're doing research at your institution. Now, you don't necessarily have to set up an IRB yourself. You can have access to an external IRB, but research has to be reviewed by an IRB, meaning prospectively research has to be reviewed if it's looking at human subjects to see if they're going to be put at risk it's looking to look at informed consent to ensure that the research has value. So, and that's what an IRB is tasked with doing. So if you submitted a protocol and said, I just want to test whether amputating people's legs is possible, that would probably not, I hope, that would not get approved by an IRB, because they would ask a question about, well, what would that value of that research be? Even if they could obtain consent, and even if we can mitigate the risk of harm, they would say, well, what's the value actually of that research? And you can see that a research proposal could fail on any criteria. But this is what IRBs are in place to actually do. There are tons of different trials, different types of research that can happen in an organization. So you can have clinical trials, which are performed oftentimes in academic health centers and other teaching hospitals, but not exclusively to them. There's practice of medicine research, which is often in hospitals. It's happening broader outside HMOs, where they're taking collected data and survey research to evaluate medicine, whether medicine's working. There can be research around patient satisfaction, and there can be research around outcomes measures. What I think you need to take away from this is that there are different types of research that can happen in a setting. There are very complex things, complex questions about quality improvement. Is that research? The Board of Governors exam is not going to be testing you on that stuff. They're just going to be looking at the types of research that you may be doing. Okay, next is a thing I will tell you that I actually had a question about advanced directives on my exam. I can't remember the question, but I remember there being a question. So keep in mind, advanced directives are, there's a D on it, it's advanced, not advanced. Advanced directives. Persons, basically, we all should know these, you all should have them, but it's basically your wishes about accepting or refusing interventions or treatment in the future when you can't speak for yourself. Okay, there are tons of different types of advanced directives. There are things called living wills, which specify your treatment preferences. There are things like that we'll see around in some states around natural death acts and death with dignity laws. We don't have that in Georgia, and there's no specific question about, if I understand correctly, no specific question about like California's legislation. You can interpret a DNR as an advanced directive because it is a preference that someone indicates that people make. And then the other thing that you need to know around advanced directives is about what substituted judgment is. So advanced directives are documents or written preferences that people make about their treatment in a future state when they can't make a decision for themselves. What we ask people who are named in the directive to adhere to is this idea of substituted judgment. We say, first, what are the patient preferences? If you don't know those, then what is substituted judgment? It means if I knew the patient's previous behaviors, values, and goals, how would they make a decision based on their current understanding of their clinical situation? And then you're supposed to step into that, okay? That's roughly how substituted judgment works. There's a third standard called best interest, which we've sort of talked around beneficence already. And that's around, if I don't know any patient's preference, goals, or previous behavior, how do I make a decision that promotes this patient's welfare? Like, what is in their best interest? Note that the Patient Self-Determination Act, I believe of 1984, requires organizations that receive Medicare or Medicaid to inform people about advanced directives. It is not that the patient has to complete one. It's that they have to be informed that they are available and can be completed, right? So it's not that you have to say, you have to do this directive. That's not what the PSDA says. It says that you have to make people aware that they are available and can be completed. Okay. Just making sure our time. All right, so patients' bills of rights, we all have these in our organizations. So they suggest the appropriate relationships between the patient and the organization. They talk about how to maximize patient autonomy while relativizing the health services organization. And they specify patients' responsibility in the care process. So patients' bill of rights say things like, you have a right to understand what you're being charged for. You have a right to for adequate pain management. At the same time, patients' bills of rights often talk about responsibilities, like patients have a responsibility to be respectful of the healthcare providers and team that are taking care of them. They have a responsibility to supply correct information about their finances, right? And those are the types of things you might see on the Board of Governors. So complete and truthful, patients' rights. So they have a right to have complete and truthful information, a right to respect, a right to not be discriminated against, a right to participate, sort of gone through these. Privacy, a right to participate in their decision-making. You also have a right to have your privacy protected, right, to a certain extent, and that's what HIPAA actually covers. So notice that HIPAA does allow you to release private health information. This is something we often hear from people. You can release private health information to another provider if it's necessary in order to complete treatment, payment, or operations. Other disclosures, right, may require patient authorization, right? And so this is about, HIPAA is about, right, the health, is about privacy in healthcare, right? And we often hear people say, well, I can't tell people information. No, HIPAA allows you to release healthcare information to other providers for the treatment, payment, and operations. And that's what the Board of Governors is looking for, is, do you understand? You don't have to go read HIPAA. It's very, very, very long, but that HIPAA does cover privacy for patients and the protection of their information, but that there are, it is not absolute that you can reach out to other providers for treatment, payment, and operations. Know that everyone, and this is a pretty straightforward thing, but everyone, there are expectations for ethical conduct that have been set by trade organizations and professional organizations. Patients should be, healthcare providers and institutions should do their best to accommodate religious and social preferences whenever possible, but there are limits. There are absolutely limits to this. I think one that we are grappling with, and I think you're seeing a lot of professional statements around this, is about patients' requests for providers based on race or ethnicity. And I think what we're seeing a lot of organizations come out against is to say that you can't do that patients can't request providers based on race and ethnicity. And so there are expectations ultimately to say there are expectations of ethical conduct of everyone who's practicing within an organization. So there is no expectation, though, that the organization is legally compliant value system, as said here, is expressed in its statement of organizational philosophy, right? I'm sorry. So what this is basically telling us is you can't, we have to be careful about the organization's services based on their values. And you'll see here, there are a few, like governmental facilities cannot enforce theological based positions because this is doesn't adhere to a constitutional establishment of religion, separation of church and state. What's very interesting is if an organization has a value system, right, that's in a particular theological perspective, we have theological based organizations and they can practice to their particular religion, right, and are not necessarily forced to adhere to it. The one that often comes up is around, and I've worked for Catholic organizations in the past, about Catholic organizations and providing direct abortions, right, that, you know, they're not legally mandated to do that, right, even though they're, partly because that would be a violation of their values. Now, it does get into more complex situation when a Catholic healthcare is the only facility that provides care in a certain geographical distance, because that might violate other laws. But for the most part, you'll see these things sort of hold true, like governmental facilities provide services that non-governmental facilities may not be forced to provide. So you may have a values-based organization that says it's not going to provide abortion, and a government facility would not be able to do that because that would be a violation of the separation of church and state. All right. About coming into the home stretch. So one other thing that's covered in this section of the exam is conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest occur when the concerns or aims of two different parties are incompatible, right? So the conflict of interest between elected officials and corporate lobbyists, or I hold a large stock in some medical device and I'm saying I want to bring a perfect example. I own stock in a board game that's around advanced care planning, and that's the department I lead. And I say, well, I want my organization to buy this board game. There appears to be a conflict of interest, and there are ways to mediate conflicts of interest, right? But there appears to be a conflict of interest in that situation, right? Because my aim is to make money off the board game, and my aim as an institutional official is to do the best thing for the organization. It may be that the board game does that, but there's an apparent conflict of interest here, right? But the reason is because I'm in a position to derive institutional or personal benefit. And we know that healthcare leaders, right, are often put in situations of conflict of interest, and we need to ensure that they get mitigated. So a conflict of interest is a situation in which a person in a position to derive institutional or personal benefit from the actions is in their sort of official capacity and can make that decision and derive that benefit. So look, the reality is you should try everything you can to avoid conflicts of interest. They're not, you're going to do your best, but they're going to be tough to avoid. Once a conflict has developed, you should disclose it, and you should do everything you can to remove yourself from the position of decision making. And that's sort of what's supported in the American College of Healthcare Executives Code of Ethics and in their statement on conflicts of interest. And then you should implement a no, oftentimes what ACHE says is there should be a no gift policy so that it leaves no gifts on the table, like, hey, yes, you can come in here and do this demonstration, make sure you leave food, right? That I think organizations are shifting to that we can't have we don't want, even if it's the case that it's not influencing, which there's some data that suggests it does, even if that's not the case, we also don't want the perception that it could, because then it doesn't look like we're acting for the benefit of our community and the benefit of healthcare organizations at large. So here are some examples. A director is a partner in a law firm that acts as general counsel to the hospital. A decision maker is an owner of a business that offers goods or service to the hospital. A decision maker is an owner or business that competes with the hospital, and a decision maker is having a romantic relationship with a subordinate. And these are all conflicts of interest examples, and everything should be done to mediate them and eliminate them to the best of our ability. So there are key areas where conflicts of interest come up, lots of times at governing boards, because governing boards, there'll be people from the community who have businesses that could be a personal stake for the healthcare organization. There's lots with management, given your relationships and affiliations and things that you may need to purchase, or friends or connections you may have. And then lots and lots in procurement, right? That you know, supply chain and bringing things into the organization. There can be conflicts of interest that occur there, right? There are different policies. I think the standard is that there should be conflicts of interest disclosure statements. The question becomes who should complete them and how often. I've seen variation amongst organizations, you know, that everyone, supervisor and above, director and above, executive and above, whatever it may be, and they complete them annually every 6 months. And the reason to do that is to ensure that the organization is not standing in a conflict, right? That we're trying to do the best thing for whatever healthcare organization we may work for. Full disclosure, as I said, I think I said, but if I didn't, let me just say this. I'm a philosopher by training, and so law is not my specialty, but you don't have to go and read legislative rules or anything about pieces of legislation. I'm going to them very but you'll also cover them in other sections. So the Barnes-Oxley Act of 2002 said, look, you have to be open in disclosure about what we about financial information, right? So it said you have to it provided guidelines to improve the accuracy and reliability of corporate disclosure. It put certification on financial reports by CEOs and CFOs, right? So we see audits happen. Put ban on personal loans to executives, right? Public reporting of CEO and CFO compensations and profits. Internal independent audits with external audit certifications. It gave protections for people to report unethical behavior. This is a lot of the whistleblower stuff. It asked for codes of ethics and standards of conduct for executive officers and board members. And it asked people to have an ongoing basis to look for conflicts of interest in the organization. And you saw that, right? How frequently do you do it? It's not it wasn't specified in the Barnes-Oxley Act how many times, but it needs to at least happen continuously in some form or fashion. The next thing is the Stark Law. This is a set of laws that prohibits physician self-referral. Specifically, it says a referral by a physician of a Medicare or Medicaid patient to an entity providing designated health services. So what they're worried here is that there would be kickbacks, right? So I make a referral. I'm working in an inpatient setting and I refer to myself, right? And I think the worry is they want to make sure that there's not some financial and perverse incentive that's going on. The Stark Law is an expansive law. There's a lot of twists and turns into it. What's on the screen is in essence what you need to know for the Board of Governors exam for the Ethics and Professionalism section. Remember that the ACHE Code of Ethics says that ACHE affiliates are expected to accept no gift or benefit offered with the express or implied expectation of influencing a management decision. You cannot take things, and this is on the test, you cannot take things if it's that's with the intent of influencing your decision. So tickets to a cruise, here, do this, buy our product, right? And what they suggest is that a no gratuities is the cleanest and clearest approach because it leaves nothing to the judgment of the leader. Okay. So what are the other elements of a profession as we're in the home stretch? This is the last part. So there are clear things that are components of an element of profession. So specialized knowledge and training, public service orientation, transmission of values and norms, a code of ethics, continuing education, self-regulation, professional association, Samaritanism, and charity. And you'll see this in almost every profession. Think about nursing, think about physicians, think about healthcare executives. All of them meet these criteria. We know we have clear responsibilities as professionals, and this is sort of what the test is looking for, that we are supposed to be honest and have integrity, respect, fairness, and good faith. We're supposed to comply with laws and regulations, be competent and proficient, right? Avoid conflicts of interest, positive public information programs, and respect for other professions. It's sort of the elements of a profession, how do you live out them? How are you professional? And it's basically living a moral life of excellence in a chosen profession. That is it. So I want to thank you all for being with me today. I really look forward to our question and answer session during the live discussion. If you should have comments or questions or things you want to ask me, feel free. This is my email address. Would love to hear from you. Always open to comments and considerations. Very nice to talk with you, and we'll talk together soon.